The world has seen many brilliant scientists, but few have burned as brightly, as rebelliously, and as playfully as Richard Phillips Feynman. He was not merely a physicist, he was a force of nature. In lecture halls, he electrified students with his vivid explanations of quantum mysteries. In the deserts of Los Alamos, he worked tirelessly on the atomic bomb, driven as much by patriotic duty as by insatiable curiosity. And in the corners of his mind, he composed bongo rhythms, sketched nudes, broke safes, and pondered the essence of truth. Feynman wasn't just a genius in the ivory tower. He was a showman who rejected pretense, an adventurer who laughed in the face of bureaucracy, and a philosopher who refused to accept anything on authority alone. He believed that the pursuit of knowledge was a kind of spiritual calling, an endless journey of asking why, with the same childlike wonder he carried from the streets of Far Rockaway to the laboratories of Caltech. Yet for all his charisma and acclaim, Richard Feynman also bore hidden scars, grief, guilt, and private doubts that haunted even his most triumphant moments. His first love died slowly of tuberculosis. Her passing etched into the quantum equations he scrawled with trembling hands. He was a man who laughed easily, but who also pondered deeply the nature of death, the burden of knowledge, and the moral ambiguities of his contributions to the atomic age. This is the story of Richard Feynman, not just the Nobel Prize winner or the author of witty memoirs, but the complex, contradictory, and captivating human being behind the legend. It is a story of brilliance and eccentricity, of joy and sorrow, of play and precision. And above all, it is the story of a mind unchained. Richard Phillips Feynman was born on May 11, 1918, in Far Rockaway, a seaside neighborhood in Queens, New York. His parents, Melville and Lucille Feynman, were Jewish immigrants of Russian and Polish descent. Though not rich in material means, the Feynman household brimmed with intellectual energy. Melville, a uniformed salesman with the mind of a philosopher, took an unconventional approach to parenting. He would ask young Richard questions like, "Do you know what makes a train go?" and then challenge him to think beyond the obvious. He taught Richard never to memorize answers, but to understand concepts. "See that bird?" he once said. "I can tell you its name in many languages, but when you're done, you'll know nothing about the bird. Learn what it does. That's what counts." This emphasis on real understanding would become Richard's scientific signature. While other children learned by rote, Richard dismantled radios, fixed household gadgets, and built experiments in the family garage. He once rewired his home's alarm system just for fun. Before long, neighbors called him the boy who fixes radios by thinking. Lucille, his mother, brought humor into the mix. A sharp-witted woman with a theatrical flair, she encouraged Richard's imagination and sense of play. Her influence gave Feynman a comedic instinct that would later shine in his lectures and public appearances. By the time he entered elementary school, Richard was already teaching himself algebra from library books. He devoured mathematics, fascinated not only by numbers, but by the logic that bound them. His school teachers were sometimes baffled by him. He refused to conform to lesson plans, often working several grade levels ahead, but his brilliance was unmistakable. In high school at Far Rockaway High, he formed a small physics club with friends where they performed homemade experiments, blew fuses, and argued about relativity. He also developed a deep admiration for Einstein and his revolutionary ideas. By age 15, he had independently derived the Pythagorean theorem and was solving integrals using methods he hadn't yet learned in class. He was also, notably, completely unpretentious. Even in his teens, Feynman rejected affectation. While others wore their intellect like a badge, Feynman was more interested in playing pranks, cracking jokes, and proving that deep thinking didn't require serious faces. Despite his undeniable intelligence, Feynman never saw himself as a genius in the romantic sense. He viewed learning as a process of asking good questions and working hard for answers. "I'm not smarter than others," he would say. "I just stay with problems longer." That spirit of persistence and curiosity soon caught the attention of MIT, where Feynman would next take his talents. But before leaving New York, Feynman experienced one of the first emotional setbacks of his life. His beloved grandmother passed away. Her death unsettled him, not just emotionally, but philosophically. He became fascinated by the idea of time, entropy, and mortality. Why do things decay? Why does time move forward? These weren't just questions for physicists, they were questions that would shape his worldview for decades. And so, with a suitcase full of math books, a bongo drum, and an almost manic enthusiasm for problem solving, Richard Feynman left home for the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He didn't yet know that he would one day sit among the greatest scientists in history. All he knew was that there were mysteries to unravel, patterns to uncover, and truths to chase. And chase them he would with a passion that would never fade. When Richard Feynman arrived at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, in the fall of 1935, he stepped into a realm that seemed perfectly tailored to his unquenchable curiosity. MIT, already a hub of American scientific progress, was home to rigorous coursework, demanding professors, and a culture that rewarded creativity as much as correctness. For Feynman, it was paradise. He quickly distinguished himself not through flair or pedigree, but through sheer performance. As a freshman, he aced the entrance exams in mathematics and physics, placing himself at the top of the class. But grades were never his true goal. "What I cannot create, I do not understand," he would later write on his blackboard. He was there to understand. Feynman began his studies in mathematics, but soon felt it lacked the dynamism he sought. Pure math, for all its elegance, felt too detached from the messy, unpredictable nature of the universe. He found more fulfillment in physics, where equations danced with reality and abstractions collided with experiments. He switched his major and never looked back. MIT's physics department introduced him to the foundations of classical mechanics, thermodynamics, electromagnetism, and most crucially, quantum mechanics, a field still in its adolescent years. Feynman devoured the writings of Dirac, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, and Bohr. The uncertainty principle, wave-particle duality, and quantum probability didn't confuse him. They thrilled him. But Feynman didn't just absorb knowledge. He questioned everything. While most students were content learning Bohr's interpretation of quantum mechanics, Feynman wasn't satisfied with philosophical pronouncements. He wanted models, mechanisms, clarity. He once remarked, "I think I can safely say that nobody understands quantum mechanics, but that doesn't mean we stop trying." His professors quickly recognized a student unlike any other. Even as an undergraduate, Feynman was developing novel approaches to problems. When asked to solve classical physics assignments, he often turned in solutions that bypassed the standard methods entirely, using more elegant and sometimes more complex mathematical paths. It was during this time that Feynman began to develop his signature Feynman style of thinking, breaking down complicated problems into visual or intuitive analogies. If he couldn't see the answer in his mind, he kept working until he could. He treated equations like instruments, tools that needed to be wielded, not worshipped. Feynman was known to work on problems long after others had given up. Once, he spent several days trying to find a new method of calculating the moment of inertia of a hollow cone, despite already knowing the answer from class. "I'm not happy unless I can do it my own way," he told a friend. In his dorm, he scrawled equations on the walls, notepads, napkins, and even bathroom mirrors. He played bongos to clear his head. His roommate recalled that Feynman would sometimes burst into laughter, not from a joke, but from the joy of understanding something new. It was also during his MIT years that Feynman deepened his relationship with a girl he had known since childhood, Arlene Greenbaum. She was witty, artistic, and spirited, a perfect foil to Feynman's logical intensity. Despite his natural awkwardness and romance, Arlene understood him. They exchanged letters, poems, and puzzles, nurturing a deep emotional bond. But tragedy was already beginning to take shape. Arlene began suffering from what doctors initially thought were flu symptoms. It would later be diagnosed as tuberculosis, a terminal illness at the time. Still, Feynman was unwavering. He didn't care. He loved her. Their bond would define much of his emotional life through college and beyond. MIT was not just about lectures, it encouraged student research, and Feynman thrived in this environment. Under the mentorship of Professor John Slater and others, he worked on problems in quantum electrodynamics and atomic theory. He began thinking about how radiation and matter interacted, a theme that would later earn him a Nobel Prize. His senior thesis, Forces in Molecules, challenged existing assumptions about the way molecules behaved at the quantum level. Rather than rely on energy minimization like most chemists did, he used force diagrams to describe interatomic interactions. The approach was novel, visual, and highly effective. One professor later said, "It was the most brilliant undergraduate thesis I've ever seen." The hidden side, humor and mischief. Even as he soared academically, Feynman never lost his love for humor and mischief. He was a regular at campus pranks, once rewiring a classmate's room to make lights flicker in Morse code. He joined the MIT Tech Model Railroad Club, where he learned how to pick locks, a skill he would hone to legendary status at Los Alamos. He also loved playing tricks with language. He read books on Latin, Greek, and even Mayan hieroglyphs. To amuse himself, he'd write physics notes backward or translate them into French. "If it's not fun, I don't want to do it," he said often. By the time Feynman graduated from MIT in 1939 with a degree in physics, his professors were in unanimous agreement. He was destined for greatness. Several of them wrote glowing recommendations to Princeton University, where Feynman would enter graduate school that same year. But before he left Boston, he visited Arlene, now weakened and frequently hospitalized. Though they were not yet married, he promised her that he would never abandon her. It was a vow made not just with words, but with the kind of loyalty that would haunt and define him for the rest of his life. In the fall of 1939, with war brewing in Europe and uncertainty gripping the world, Richard Feynman packed up his notebooks and his dreams and headed to Princeton. There, he would dive deeper into the quantum realm, brush shoulders with giants like Einstein, and begin to carve out his place in history. The fire had been lit, and it was only growing hotter. In the fall of 1939, Richard Feynman arrived at Princeton University for his graduate studies. Though just 21, he carried with him the momentum of a rising star. Princeton, the intellectual nucleus of American theoretical physics, was home to titans like Albert Einstein, Eugene Wigner, Wolfgang Pauli, frequent visitor, and John Archibald Wheeler, who would become Feynman's doctoral advisor and lifelong friend. Yet Feynman, in typical fashion, was not intimidated. "When I was young," he later wrote, "I had the hubris to say, I can do just as well as those guys, maybe better." He didn't say it out of arrogance, but out of an unshakable belief that problems, no matter how complex, could be cracked with persistence, creativity, and logical clarity. At Princeton, Feynman immersed himself in advanced courses in quantum mechanics, statistical mechanics, and field theory. But what excited him most were the open problems, the unexplored corners of physical theory. With John Wheeler's guidance, Feynman dove into the mystery of the electron's self-interaction, a puzzle that had confounded physicists for decades. Classical electrodynamics predicted infinite self-energy for a point-like electron. How could a theory produce nonsensical infinities and still describe reality so well? Feynman's answer: perhaps the electron doesn't act on itself at all. He began developing a radical framework called the action at a distance theory, which treated electromagnetic interactions not through local fields, but through particles communicating directly via advanced and retarded waves, signals going backward and forward in time. This wasn't science fiction, it was theoretical physics on the edge of reason. His ideas were revolutionary, but not yet widely accepted. Still, his confidence grew. His brain danced through equations, his chalk scratched furiously on blackboards, and Wheeler, impressed, told others, "This guy is special. We're watching something rare." While Feynman's scientific career flourished, his emotional life darkened. His fiancée, Arlene Greenbaum, was dying. Now confined to a sanatorium in New Jersey, she struggled with severe tuberculosis. Her letters, though cheerful, carried undertones of resignation. Feynman visited her frequently, riding buses, often doing quantum calculations on scraps of paper along the way. He was warned against marrying her. Friends said it would derail his career. Doctors said the emotional toll would be unbearable, but Feynman refused to abandon her. In June 1942, against the advice of nearly everyone in his circle, they married in a small private ceremony. He wore gloves because of the infection risk. They would never live together as husband and wife in a traditional sense. Instead, he continued his studies while she remained in medical care, and they exchanged passionate, poetic letters. In one, Arlene wrote, "You make life such a beautiful thing, even when I am at the edge." Feynman, deeply in love and silently heartbroken, poured himself even harder into his research. Science became both his escape and his catharsis. In the final year of his graduate studies, Feynman began rethinking quantum mechanics itself. The standard formalism, with its matrix operators and wave functions, struck him as clunky, too abstract, too removed from physical intuition. One day, he revisited an old method from classical physics, the principle of least action, a method where the path taken by a system is one that minimizes or extremizes a certain quantity called action. What if, he thought, quantum particles didn't take just one path but every possible path? He began sketching a framework where particles explored all trajectories from point A to point B, with each path contributing a probability amplitude. It was the beginning of the path integral formulation of quantum mechanics, a viewpoint that would forever change how physicists understood motion, uncertainty, and probability. Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study was home to the most revered minds of the time, and Feynman occasionally crossed paths with Albert Einstein himself. While they never worked closely together, Einstein was aware of the brash young physicist from New York who approached science like a puzzle box. Feynman also made friends and rivals. He socialized with Freeman Dyson, became fast friends with Hans Bethe, and challenged Niels Bohr's philosophical interpretations of quantum theory during seminars. But he remained irreverent. He once described Princeton's atmosphere as too serious, mocking the refined formalities of professors who wore ties to breakfast. He preferred plain language to academic posturing. Feynman's PhD thesis, titled The Principle of Least Action in Quantum Mechanics, submitted in 1942, was a watershed moment. Though largely ignored at the time due to its unconventional methods, it introduced the world to path integrals and a completely new way of doing quantum physics. The path integral approach allowed physicists to treat quantum phenomena using a visual, intuitive picture of sum over histories. It would take years before the physics community truly grasped its elegance and power. Feynman's work was so novel, even Wheeler had difficulty explaining it to colleagues. But he believed in it. Feynman's formulation, he said, is one of those rare gems that makes everything else look obsolete. Just as Feynman submitted his dissertation, the world changed. In December 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States entered World War II, and soon after, Feynman received an invitation that would alter his life and history forever. The government was assembling a secret team of scientists in Los Alamos, New Mexico, to work on a top-secret military project, the atomic bomb. John Wheeler recommended Feynman immediately. So did Bethy. Though torn, Arlene was worsening, and he feared leaving her. Feynman agreed. He reasoned that if the Nazis were racing toward the bomb, America had no choice. And besides, he was curious. In early 1943, he boarded a train for the desert. Ahead lay classified physics, encrypted notebooks, and the weight of an entire war on the shoulders of scientists. He would arrive in New Mexico as Dr. Richard Feynman, no longer a student, but a pivotal player in the most secret scientific project in human history. In early 1943, Richard Feynman arrived at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, a secret facility nestled high in the desert plateau. Officially, the site didn't exist. It was a ghost town of chalkboards, bunkers, and brilliant minds, all working under the gravest of shadows, the race to build the world's first atomic bomb. Feynman, just 24 years old, was one of the youngest theoretical physicists in the project, but his youth belied his genius. The leaders of the Manhattan Project, including Robert Oppenheimer, quickly recognized Feynman's extraordinary talent. He was appointed to work in the theoretical division under Hans Bethe, who would become both a mentor and a lifelong admirer. Feynman was a volcano of ideas, Bethe would later say. You gave him a problem, and he didn't just solve it, he redefined it. Life at Los Alamos was a blend of isolation and intensity. The scientists were cut off from the world. No phones, no letters, no public acknowledgement of their work. Everything was classified. Feynman, of course, found ways to make even this environment an opportunity for creativity. He became notorious for cracking safes that held secret documents not to steal, but to demonstrate the weaknesses in security. He wanted people to think like physicists even when it came to locks. He once opened the filing cabinet of a senior military officer, finding the code written on a piece of paper tucked inside the handle. In another instance, he deduced a lab director's safe combination by watching him spin the dial and guessing based on mechanical feedback. These antics weren't malicious. Feynman was warning the military brass. We're building the most powerful weapon in history. You'd better protect the plans better than this. He even held informal lessons for lab workers, teaching them how to pick locks and think like puzzle solvers. Some appreciated it, others were infuriated, but no one could stop him. He was, after all, Feynman. Feynman's actual scientific contributions to the Manhattan Project were crucial. He worked primarily on the theoretical side, developing mathematical models to predict the behavior of nuclear chain reactions. His expertise in neutron diffusion helped the team determine how neutrons spread through fissile material, a key element in calculating critical mass and explosive yield. Working with Bethe, Feynman devised new techniques for solving differential equations quickly, often using slide rules, paper charts, and improvised analog computing methods. In a world before digital computers, Feynman's speed and precision were legendary. He also helped set up theoretical frameworks for the design of implosion-type weapons, specifically how shock waves would converge on a core of plutonium to initiate a chain reaction. His work formed the backbone of calculations used for the Trinity test, the world's first nuclear detonation. While Feynman cracked equations and safes in Los Alamos, his heart remained in Albuquerque, where Arlene was hospitalized in a nearby sanitarium. He visited as often as he could, riding the train or hitching rides through the desert. Their visits were bittersweet, filled with laughter, tenderness, and pain. Despite her declining health, Arlene remained Feynman's emotional anchor. She encouraged him to pursue his work, even as tuberculosis ravaged her lungs. They exchanged letters full of physics, jokes, and private codes. She gave him strength, and he, in return, gave her hope. But in June 1945, just weeks before the Trinity test, Arlene's condition collapsed. Feynman rushed to her side, arriving only hours before she passed away. He was devastated. After her death, he retreated into himself. At night, he wandered the mesa, staring at the stars. He questioned the point of it all, the science, the bomb, the war. Everything seemed hollow. I wanted to scream at the heavens, he later wrote. What good was all this knowledge if it couldn't save the only person I truly loved? Still, he returned to Los Alamos quietly, mechanically, and continued his work. On the 16th of July, 1945, the Trinity test lit up the New Mexico sky. Feynman, ever curious, ignored safety warnings and watched the explosion through a truck windshield, reasoning that the glass would filter out harmful UV radiation. His eyes survived, but he admitted later that it was a foolish risk. Still, he was in awe. The blast was unlike anything the world had seen. A sun born from man's hand, ripping the desert in half with light and fury. Feynman described it as a kind of grandeur you can't put into words. But the triumph was short-lived. Days later, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed by nuclear bombs. Feynman, like many scientists, was haunted. At first, he felt the project had been necessary a race against Nazi Germany. But after the war, he realized the bomb had changed the world in a way that could never be undone. I felt a kind of emptiness, like now we've done it, but what have we done? With the war over and the project declassified, Feynman was offered a faculty position at Cornell University. He accepted not because he was eager to teach, but because he needed purpose. Arlene was gone. The war was over. Science was all he had left. At Cornell, he tried to rebuild his life. He played bongos in local clubs. He sketched in notebooks. He solved problems sometimes obsessively, but often he felt detached, as if the world was moving while he remained frozen in grief. In a quiet corner of his desk, Feynman kept a letter, a final one, written to Arlene after her death. He wrote it late one night, unable to sleep, pouring his feelings onto the page. I find it hard even to talk to people. I do not know what to say. I feel so utterly lonely. I love my wife. My wife is dead. He never sent it. But he never discarded it either. The letter was discovered after his death in 1988, still in the drawer, still addressed to her. It was perhaps the most vulnerable moment of Feynman's life, the genius physicist reduced to a grieving husband, whispering into silence. The Manhattan Project had thrust Feynman into history, but it had also scarred him. He emerged from Los Alamos as a celebrity among scientists, but also as a man carrying invisible wounds. The loss of Arlene, the weight of the bomb, the burden of knowledge. And yet, the next phase of his life, one defined not by war, but by wonder, was just beginning. The end of World War II found Richard Feynman in a state of both professional triumph and personal devastation. He had helped bring about one of the most consequential scientific achievements in human history, the atomic bomb, but had lost his beloved Arlene in the process. The war had changed the world. Arlene's death had changed Feynman. And so, in the fall of 1945, he arrived at Cornell University, a young widower and war scientist looking for meaning in a post-war world. Cornell, nestled in the hills of Ithaca, New York, was the opposite of Los Alamos, peaceful, verdant, and far from the military-industrial machine. It should have been a perfect refuge, but Feynman wasn't at peace. He was only 27, but emotionally aged. Arlene's death had left a hollow space in his soul. He walked to lectures with a haunted look, often pausing mid-sentence as if caught in memories. He still heard her voice, still imagined her laugh, still wrote letters to her in his head. Despite his grief, Cornell welcomed him with open arms. He was given a faculty position in the physics department with the freedom to explore research and teach as he pleased. But for months, Feynman struggled to focus. He confessed to colleagues that he felt like a fraud, that the magic of physics had drained from his mind. "I couldn't do any real work," he later wrote. "Everything seemed pointless." During this difficult period, Feynman turned to non-scientific pursuits. He began playing the bongo drums, losing himself in the rhythm and noise. He joined student art clubs, learning to draw with charcoal and ink. He frequented diners and clubs not to socialize, but to sit alone and observe. He also read voraciously poetry, detective novels, philosophy, and ancient mythology. He was fascinated by how people outside of science made sense of the world. Not everything, he realized, needs to be understood with a formula. These diversions weren't distractions. They were survival mechanisms. He needed time for the storm to pass, and slowly it did. One day, as he sat in the Cornell cafeteria, something clicked. He was watching a student throw a plate into the air. The plate wobbled and spun. Most people would have ignored it, but not Feynman. He scribbled calculations on napkins and started deriving the mathematics of spinning plates. It was meaningless, he admitted, but it was fun. "I started to play with physics again, just for the fun of it. That's when I started to recover." That wobbling plate would lead him back into the heart of theoretical physics and toward the development of one of the most powerful tools in the quantum world, the path integral. Feynman revisited his earlier ideas from Princeton, his radical concept that particles don't follow a single trajectory, but instead explore all possible paths. At Los Alamos, the idea had been shelved, but now, at Cornell, he nurtured it again, letting it evolve into a comprehensive framework. This was the birth of the path integral formulation of quantum mechanics. Using advanced mathematics and deep physical insight, Feynman showed that the sum over all paths, a kind of quantum calculus of probabilities, could replicate the results of Schrödinger's and Heisenberg's more abstract approaches. This wasn't just an alternative, it was a conceptual revolution. It made quantum theory more intuitive, more visual, and vastly more applicable to particle physics. But even more important than the equations was what it meant to Feynman personally. He was back. The man who once stared blankly at chalkboards was now scribbling so fast that assistants couldn't keep up. He returned to teaching with renewed passion, stunning students with his ability to make quantum phenomena feel understandable. Within a few years, the physics world had caught wind of the wild-haired professor at Cornell who was reinventing quantum mechanics. Fellow physicists were intrigued, his lectures were packed. Young theorists wrote him letters filled with questions and admiration. In 1947, Feynman was invited to present his path integral method at a major American Physical Society meeting. The response was electric. Many couldn't follow the math, but everyone sensed a shift in the paradigm. He spoke in pictures, one attendee recalled. You didn't understand every step, but you felt the truth of what he said. That same year, he began working on a related problem, one that would later earn him the Nobel Prize: how to describe the interaction of light and matter with quantum accuracy. This field was known as quantum electrodynamics, QED, and it was a mess. Infinite results, nonsensical predictions, and theoretical disagreements had plagued it for decades. Feynman, along with Julian Schwinger and Sinatiro Tominaga, would soon clean it up. But while others used long formal derivations, Feynman approached the problem his way, with diagrams. Feynman began sketching space-time diagrams to visualize particle interactions. A photon emitted here, an electron absorbed there. These simple line drawings allowed complex quantum interactions to be calculated with ease. He turned blackboard chaos into visual maps of the invisible world. These would become known as Feynman diagrams, a staple in every physicist toolkit to this day. They weren't just clever illustrations, they transformed quantum field theory from a labyrinth of equations into a tool set for real-world predictions. In time, physicists would use them to calculate everything from subatomic collisions to cosmic background radiation. They became the Rosetta Stone of particle physics. By 1949, Richard Feynman was no longer the grieving war scientist. He was now one of the most respected and sought-after theoretical physicists in the world. He still carried Arlene's memory, he always would, but it no longer consumed him. In a letter to a friend, he wrote, "I finally feel like I'm doing what I was meant to do again. The joy is back." That joy would soon take him to a new home, the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, where he would stay for the rest of his career. There, he would teach, innovate, inspire, and become not just a legend of physics, but a legend of life. In the early 1952, physics was at a crossroads. The great theories of the 20th century, relativity, quantum mechanics, and electromagnetism, had revolutionized science, but had also left behind a tangled mess of equations and conceptual confusion. One of the most tangled of all was quantum electrodynamics, QED, the theory describing how light and matter interact at the quantum level. It was a swamp of infinities. A calculation might begin with sensible terms and end with infinity utter nonsense. Physicists had ways to cancel those infinities through a mathematical process called renormalization, but few understood why it worked. It felt like patchwork, not theory. Enter Richard Feynman. He wasn't just trying to fix QED, he was trying to see it. Feynman had always preferred thinking in pictures. While other physicists pondered abstract matrices and long differential equations, Feynman drew lines, dots, loops, arrows. To him, physics was a choreography of particles across space and time. And so, he turned QED into a visual language, a method where every interaction between particles could be drawn, analyzed, and understood as a kind of cosmic diagram. Imagine an electron moving forward in time. It's a straight line. Imagine it emits a photon that's a kink in the line, with a curly line representing the photon shooting away. The photon hits another electron, that's another kink. With just a few lines, Feynman could describe the complex dance of particles and forces, reducing entire pages of equations into intuitive visual stories. At first, many physicists were skeptical. Feynman's method seemed too simple, too informal. These doodles, one critic scoffed, aren't real physics. But when calculations were done properly, rigorously, they matched experimental results with extraordinary precision. Better yet, they made previously impossible computations accessible, even elegant. Feynman diagrams quickly proved their worth in calculating scattering amplitudes in quantum field theory, understanding vacuum fluctuations, predicting the magnetic moment of the electron to 1 part in a billion accuracy, describing particle decay processes in nuclear physics, and they were beautiful. They showed time flowing from left to right or bottom to top. Particles zipped along, forces rippled across space. You didn't just calculate, you saw the physics unfold. Young physicists were instantly drawn to them. For the first time, they had a toolkit to enter the quantum world without drowning in equations. Feynman's approach didn't replace Schrödinger's wave mechanics or Heisenberg's matrix mechanics. It complemented them. His path integral formulation gave deeper intuition, and his diagrams turned that into practical tools. In many ways, Feynman democratized quantum field theory. You no longer needed to be a Dirac or Schwinger to tackle QED. If you understood the rules of the diagrams, what the lines and vertices meant, you could make predictions too. It was like teaching people how to play jazz by ear instead of reading sheet music. By the early 1952, Feynman's methods were gaining serious traction. Physicists at Harvard, Princeton, and Caltech began adopting his techniques. Freeman Dyson, a brilliant young physicist from England, played a key role in translating Feynman's informal ideas into formal mathematics, bridging the gap between theory and intuition. At major physics conferences, Feynman became a star. His talks were packed. He scribbled diagrams on blackboards while telling stories, cracking jokes, and captivating audiences. In 1965, he shared the Nobel Prize in Physics with Julian Schwinger and Sein Ichiro Tominaga for their independent work on QED. But while Schwinger and Tominaga's contributions were brilliant, Feynman's were transformative. He had not only solved the theory, he had taught the world how to think differently. Soon, Feynman diagrams extended beyond QED. Physicists began using them in quantum chromodynamics, QCD, the theory of strong interactions, the electroweak theory, unifying electromagnetic and weak nuclear forces, condensed matter physics, for modeling interactions in superconductors and semiconductors, string theory, and quantum gravity research. The diagrams weren't just tools, they were windows into reality. They allowed physicists to imagine how the invisible world behaves, how virtual particles emerge and vanish, how symmetries dictate motion, how the universe speaks in code. What made Feynman even more remarkable was that he didn't keep these insights locked away in ivory towers. At Caltech, where he had moved in the early 1952nd, he became a beloved professor. His courses weren't dry lectures, they were performances, filled with analogies, demonstrations, and genuine excitement. He didn't just teach Feynman diagrams, he taught a new way of seeing the world. You don't really understand something until you can explain it to a freshman, he would often say. And so generations of Caltech students learned quantum theory not as a series of rules, but as a way of thinking. For Feynman, physics was not a burden. It was a joy, a canvas, an adventure. Feynman diagrams to him were not just calculations, they were art, elegant, efficient, alive. He once said, "The joy of finding things out, that's what drives me. Not the awards, not the glory, just the joy." This philosophy permeated every diagram he drew, each one a snapshot of the universe, each one a proof that understanding didn't have to be obscure, it could be intuitive, even beautiful. Today, Feynman diagrams remain one of the most enduring tools in modern physics. They appear in textbooks, lecture halls, computer simulations, and Nobel Prize citations. Even outside of physics, artists and designers have turned them into jewelry, tattoos, and logos. They symbolize the triumph of visual thinking in science, the idea that creativity and rigor are not opposites but partners. And at the heart of it all was Feynman, a man who doodled the universe into clarity. In 1950, Richard Feynman accepted a professorship at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, a small but elite institution nestled in Pasadena. It was a perfect match. Caltech was informal, bold, and full of ambitious young scientists, while Feynman was playful, brilliant, and unorthodox in every way. He would remain at Caltech for the rest of his life, transforming it into one of the global capitals of theoretical physics and leaving behind not only a scientific legacy, but a cultural one. Moving to California was both a geographical and psychological shift. After years on the East Coast and in wartime bunkers, the sunshine, palm trees, and relaxed attitude of the West Coast brought a kind of spiritual refreshment. Feynman rented a modest home, bought a bongo drum, and began exploring his surroundings. He loved the beaches, the mountains, and the freedom to live life on his own terms. He joined art groups in Los Angeles, explored Tijuana, and frequented jazz clubs where he sometimes performed with local musicians. But most of all, he fell in love with Caltech's spirit, its irreverence, its focus on the fundamentals, and its lack of hierarchy. Feynman was a phenomenal teacher. His lectures weren't just informative, they were electrifying. He spoke with passion, moved with energy, and drew diagrams as if he were painting. He'd leap from topic to topic, sometimes veering off into unexpected territory, then looping back with a flourish to reveal a profound insight. Students never forgot his classes. He had a rule: if you can't explain it to a freshman, you don't understand it. This forced him to continually simplify and refine his explanations. He never used jargon unless he could justify it. He avoided long derivations unless they told a story. One of his favorite techniques was analogical thinking, using familiar concepts to illuminate quantum mysteries: electrons as little bullets, photons as ripples, probability as water waves. Between 1961 and 1963, Feynman gave a series of introductory lectures at Caltech that would become legendary. The university had asked him to revamp the freshman and sophomore physics curriculum. What followed was an intellectual tour de force. These lectures, eventually compiled as the Feynman Lectures on Physics, became one of the most celebrated physics texts in history. Spanning mechanics, electromagnetism, quantum physics, statistical mechanics, and more, the 3-volume set combined clarity, rigor, and philosophical depth. They weren't just about physics, they were about how to think. Feynman discussed symmetry, conservation laws, the beauty of mathematics, and the limits of knowledge. He emphasized scientific doubt as a virtue, not a weakness. I can live with doubt and uncertainty and not knowing. That's much more interesting than having answers which might be wrong. The books became international bestsellers, translated into dozens of languages. They inspired generations of students, from high schoolers to Nobel laureates. Though he dedicated enormous energy to teaching, Feynman continued to make pioneering contributions to physics during his Caltech years. Some of his most notable work included quantum electrodynamics, QED, refining his path integral and diagrammatic approaches, superfluidity of liquid helium, using quantum mechanics to explain how helium-4 behaves like a giant wave at near absolute zero, Parton model in high-energy physics, laying the groundwork for understanding the internal structure of protons and neutrons, later leading to quantum chromodynamics, quantum computing, early insights. He was one of the first to suggest that classical computers might not be able to simulate quantum systems efficiently, leading to the birth of quantum computation. At Caltech, he also mentored dozens of graduate students, many of whom went on to become prominent physicists in their own right. Feynman's legend wasn't confined to physics. He became something of a cultural icon, a scientist who refused to act like a scientist. He picked locks for fun, played bongos in nightclubs, visited topless bars, and discussed vector calculus with dancers. He posed as an artist model and took up painting himself, signing his work as Ofei. He traveled to Brazil and learned Portuguese just to understand samba lyrics. He also continued his playful attacks on formality and pomposity. When asked to join the prestigious National Academy of Sciences, he declined publicly. "I don't believe in honors. I've already got the prize. The pleasure is in finding the thing out." He refused honorary degrees. He hated bureaucracy. He scorned prestige for prestige's sake. More than anything, Feynman was known for his relentless curiosity. He asked questions others were afraid to ask. He dismantled assumptions. He wanted to understand things from the ground up. In one famous story, he challenged a biologist at a faculty lunch. "You say a flower is beautiful, but do you understand what makes it red? Do you know how chlorophyll works? What photons are absorbed? That's not destroying beauty, that's deepening it." This encapsulated Feynman's philosophy. Science isn't the enemy of wonder, it's the engine of it. He wanted to know not just what, but why and when. Why didn't have an answer. He was comfortable living in the unknown. To students and scientists alike, Feynman was a rock star. He walked across campus in casual clothes and sandals. He carried a briefcase filled with strange gadgets and bongo sticks. He once refused to wear a cap and gown at graduation because he thought it was silly. He didn't care what others thought. He only cared about truth, joy, and doing things for their own sake. He was brilliant, but never cold, funny, but never superficial, tough, but never cruel. Feynman didn't just teach at Caltech, he reshaped it. He infused the campus with curiosity, openness, and play. He encouraged professors to connect with students, simplify their lectures, and admit when they didn't know something. He broke down the wall between classroom and research, between faculty and student, between rigor and joy. By the late 1962nd, Caltech was no longer just a place for elite physics, it was a beacon of Feynmanism, a philosophy of thinking deeply and living joyfully. By mid-career, Feynman had become something rare, a physicist who was not only respected within science, but loved outside of it. Journalists interviewed him, magazines profiled him, writers quoted him, artists painted him, students idolized him, and he never changed. He kept walking barefoot through labs, cracking jokes, giving brilliant lectures, and reminding everyone that the universe was not just strange, it was beautiful. For many scientists, legacy lies in discoveries and published papers. For Richard Feynman, it lay just as much, if not more, in the power of his teaching. And no work represents that legacy more fully than his seminal contribution to physics education, the Feynman Lectures on Physics. The challenge: rethinking how physics is taught. By the late 1952nd, Feynman had grown frustrated with how physics was being taught even at Caltech. While the university attracted the best and brightest, many students were bored or bewildered by dry lectures and formulaic textbooks. The Caltech faculty agreed it was time for a change. In 1960, a committee asked Feynman if he would consider teaching the introductory physics course for freshmen and sophomores, a job typically reserved for junior faculty. At first, Feynman hesitated. It would be a huge commitment, and he didn't want to dumb things down. But then he saw the opportunity. What if he could teach physics not as a subject, but as an adventure? He accepted, and thus began one of the most ambitious and transformative educational experiments in the history of science. In 1961, Feynman began delivering lectures to a specially selected class of Caltech undergraduates. These students were among the most gifted in the country, but even they would be challenged. Feynman didn't want to teach them formulas to memorize. He wanted to change how they thought. Every morning, he would arrive in front of a packed auditorium blackboard at the ready, chalk in hand. And then, for an hour, he would weave reality into reason. He spoke with energy, humor, and brilliance. He asked questions instead of giving answers. He told stories, used analogies, and drew diagrams with cartoonish enthusiasm. The lecture series covered nearly every major domain of physics: mechanics and radiation, electromagnetism and matter, quantum mechanics. But within those categories, Feynman explored the principle of least action, the nature of energy and entropy, wave-particle duality, the connection between math and physical law, symmetry in nature, probability and uncertainty, the architecture of atoms, and the quantum world. What set his lectures apart was their philosophical depth. Feynman constantly challenged assumptions. He'd say, "We can't define force, we can only describe how things behave." Or, "We don't know why energy is conserved, we only know it is." He avoided the arrogance of certainty and instead invited students into the messy, beautiful process of discovery. In 1959, even before his famous lecture series, Feynman had delivered a now legendary talk titled "There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom" at the American Physical Society meeting at Caltech. In it, he imagined a world where scientists could manipulate and build things atom by atom. This talk is now considered one of the founding visions of nanotechnology. In retrospect, it shows just how far ahead Feynman's thinking already was. He saw education, quantum theory, and microscopic engineering as all part of the same puzzle: how to understand and play with the fundamental layers of reality. After the lectures were delivered, Caltech administrators recognized their value. They hired physicists Robert Layton and Matthew Sands to help transcribe, edit, and organize the material into publishable form. The result, published between 1963 and 1965, was the Feynman Lectures on Physics, a 3-volume masterpiece that has since sold millions of copies and been translated into dozens of languages. It wasn't a textbook in the traditional sense. There were no problem sets, no homework questions, just ideas, richly explored and presented with clarity and passion. To this day, physicists across the world, students, professors, and hobbyists alike turn to the lectures for insight, inspiration, and delight. The impact of the Feynman lectures was international. In Russia, they were secretly translated and circulated among scientists during the Cold War. In China, they became a symbol of post-Mao scientific openness. In the U.S., they were required reading for advanced students who wanted to go beyond the basics. Feynman's voice, humorous, honest, and human, cut across cultures and time. He became, in many ways, a global ambassador for scientific thinking. Feynman's lectures didn't just educate, they inspired. Countless scientists have said that their careers began with reading his lectures. Some quote entire pages from memory. Others describe them as philosophy disguised as physics. Feynman would have smiled at that. He saw no real division between science and philosophy. Both were about curiosity, about doubt, about wondering why the sky is blue and how atoms know to follow certain rules. Feynman's teaching extended far beyond the classroom. He gave public lectures that drew packed crowds. He was frequently invited to television programs, science expos, and university keynotes. His speech patterns, New York accent, rapid-fire delivery, comedic timing made him unforgettable. He would pace the stage like a stand-up comic, pause dramatically, then explode with enthusiasm when describing an idea. Whether explaining the spin of an electron or the collapse of a star, he was always entertaining and enlightening. Feynman believed teaching wasn't about knowledge, it was about transfer of excitement. If he could make someone feel the joy of discovery, then they would seek knowledge on their own. He disliked rote memorization, he detested pretentious teachers, and he especially loathed textbooks that prioritized rigor over meaning. He once said, "Physics is like sex. Sure, it may give some practical results, but that's not why we do it." It was this blend of irreverence and insight that made his teaching so unforgettable. While Feynman would go on to do more important work, win more awards, and change more minds, he always saw his role as a teacher as central to his life. The Feynman lectures weren't a side project, they were the heart of his mission: to make the universe understandable and joyful for everyone willing to listen. He didn't teach because he had to. He taught because he loved it, and in doing so, he changed not just how physics is taught, but why. To understand Richard Feynman solely as a physicist is to miss half the story. His life was not just equations and lectures, it was curiosity lived out loud. He approached the universe as a playground, not just a problem set, and his adventures outside of academia were as rich, bizarre, and instructive as any of his scientific achievements. This chapter explores the non-scientific Feynman, the bongo drummer, the artist, the prankster, the philosopher, and the man who sought truth even in unexpected places. Rhythm and intuition. Feynman, the bongo player. Feynman's obsession with bongo drums began during his early years at Caltech. He had heard Latin percussion in music clubs around Los Angeles and was immediately entranced by the rhythm and complexity. He bought a pair of bongos and began practicing obsessively. Eventually, he started jamming with local musicians, performing under pseudonyms in nightclubs and dance halls. It wasn't a gimmick. He studied percussion with the same intensity he gave to physics. He even traveled to Brazil, where he immersed himself in the musical culture of Rio de Janeiro, playing samba rhythms and learning Portuguese. Locals were stunned that an American physicist could beat out complex carnival rhythms with such fluency. To Feynman, playing the bongos was not a distraction, it was a parallel form of thinking. Rhythm is physics. When I drum, I'm feeling the same logic that governs the universe. His ability to shift between creative and analytical modes gave his mind a unique flexibility. In physics, he saw patterns. In music, he heard them. Feynman the artist. Around the same time, Feynman began to draw. It started as curiosity. He wondered if someone as analytically wired as himself could learn to depict human faces and bodies with accuracy. So he took an art class. At first, his drawings were crude, but he persisted. He learned shading, anatomy, composition. Soon he was drawing realistic portraits, nudes, and still lifes. His style was expressive, but technically sharp. He began signing his work as au fait, a nickname derived from the slang term offbeat or offensive. He even exhibited some of his pieces at local galleries. Once, a woman asked him to sketch her nude portrait. He agreed, as long as she didn't tell anyone he was that physicist guy. He also posed nude himself for an art class, saying it was a matter of fairness. To him, art wasn't about rebellion, it was about seeing. A scientist who can't draw is missing something. Observation is the root of both science and art, the safecracker of Los Alamos. Feynman's playful nature often turned into full-fledged pranks, especially during his time at Los Alamos. With the Manhattan Project shrouded in secrecy, military officials locked away important documents in safes. Feynman, ever curious, wondered how secure they really were. So he began studying lock mechanisms, reading locksmith manuals, and practicing with a borrowed safe. Before long, he could crack most safes, on-site some, in under 10 minutes. He would leave humorous notes inside safes reading, "Guess who? RPF." Or he'd arrange the papers in a different order, just to unsettle the owner. Word spread, and many officers began to panic, believing the Soviets had infiltrated the base. Feynman had to explain his harmless intentions. Eventually, Los Alamos improved its security protocols thanks to him. The military brass was annoyed, but Oppenheimer and Bethe found it hilarious. Feynman's safecracking did more for our security awareness than any memo ever could, one colleague recalled. Dancer, traveler, and cultural chameleon. Feynman's love of new experiences extended far beyond his lab. He traveled widely, Brazil, Japan, Mexico, and beyond, not as a tourist, but as a participant. He danced with locals, learned languages, attended rituals, and studied cultural quirks. In Brazil, he gave lectures at a university and criticized rote learning in their education system. His talk, The Value of Science, delivered partly in Portuguese, is still quoted in Latin American academic circles. He even took lessons in Mayan hieroglyphics, claiming he wanted to decode something that had been lost. To Feynman, knowledge didn't live in textbooks. It was everywhere if you knew how to look. Puzzle master and hacker of minds. Feynman was a lifelong puzzle addict. Whether it was a mathematical brain teaser or a philosophical paradox, he was drawn to problems that tested the boundaries of logic. He loved magic tricks and often analyzed illusions until he could replicate them. He sometimes performed at campus parties, blending sleight of hand with science jokes. He was also a verbal and language hacker. He once learned Russian by listening to tapes and reading newspapers, just so he could read Soviet physics journals without relying on translation. Later in life, when he was recovering from illness, he taught himself how to write mirror-reversed English for no other reason than to see what my brain could do. Feynman's philosophy of life. His wide-ranging pursuits were not indulgences. They reflected a deeply held philosophy of living. Curiosity is sacred. Pleasure comes from understanding you must do things for their own sake, not for approval. The best way to learn is to play truth is more important than prestige. He disliked pretense in any form, academic, social, political. When people used jargon or complicated language to seem smarter, he would instantly dismantle them with plain speech. He had no patience for phonies and often railed against what he called cargo cult science, research that looked scientific but lacked rigor or testability. Feynman didn't compartmentalize. He didn't believe in work mode versus fun mode. To him, a well-lived life meant approaching everything with the same spirit: curiosity, play, and integrity. Whether he was computing particle trajectories, jamming on a bongo drum, sketching a nude model, or cracking a government safe, he was the same Feynman, wild, wise, and wonderfully weird. His unconventional lifestyle made him a hero not only in science, but in culture. Writers, artists, musicians, and entrepreneurs cited him as inspiration. His memoirs, including Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, and What Do You Care What Other People Think, became bestsellers. He became a symbol of creative independence, a scientist who lived by no one's rules but his own, and the lesson he offered was timeless. The world is far more interesting than any one discipline, so go ahead, learn the drums, draw, crack a safe, just don't ever stop asking why. In the winter of 1986, America was stunned by tragedy. The Space Shuttle Challenger, launched on the 28th of January, disintegrated just 73 seconds after liftoff, killing all 7 crew members, including schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe. It was one of NASA's darkest days and a national trauma. Amid the grief, a government commission was formed to investigate the cause. The panel included astronauts, generals, engineers, and one name that surprised the public: Richard Feynman. By then, Feynman was already a Nobel laureate, a best-selling author, and a beloved icon. But he was also battling cancer, and his health was deteriorating. Still, when he was asked to join the Rogers Commission, he accepted, not out of duty, but because he wanted the truth. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, he would later write. Nature cannot be fooled. From the start, Feynman felt out of place. The commission was formal, political, and cautious. The tone was diplomatic, the interviews controlled, and the access to NASA officials tightly filtered. Feynman, however, wasn't interested in political theater. He wanted facts. So, while other commissioners attended prepared briefings, Feynman wandered off script. He visited engineers, talked to technicians, asked direct questions, dug into data no one else was reading. What he found was alarming. He learned that engineers had long suspected a flaw in the O-ring seals of the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. These O-rings, made of rubber, were meant to prevent hot gases from leaking between booster segments. But in cold weather, the rubber became brittle and less likely to seal. The temperature at the time of the Challenger launch, 36 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius, the coldest shuttle launch ever. Feynman was shocked. This wasn't an unknown failure. People knew. They just didn't listen. One of the most iconic moments in Feynman's public life came during a televised hearing of the Rogers Commission. In front of reporters and cameras, Feynman pulled out a small glass of ice water and a sample O-ring provided by NASA engineers. With calm precision, he dropped the ring into the glass, waited a few moments, then removed it. He bent the rubber seal, and it snapped back slowly, instead of instantly. The message was clear. In cold temperatures, the O-ring lost elasticity, and if it didn't flex fast enough during launch, it would fail to seal, catastrophically. It was not just a brilliant demonstration, it was pure Feynman, simple, honest, undeniable. Feynman's investigation revealed more than just a technical flaw. He uncovered a culture of denial within NASA. Pressure to meet launch schedules, downplaying of risk assessments, disregard for engineer warnings, communication breakdowns between management and technical teams. He was especially disturbed by NASA's public claim that shuttle failure odds were 1 inch 100,000. Based on engineering data, Feynman estimated the odds were closer to 1 inch 100 to 1 inch 200. He famously wrote, "NASA reality seems to be different from actual flight experience." This gap between rhetoric and reality infuriated Feynman. He believed truth must never be sacrificed for image, especially when lives were on the line. As the final report of the Rogers Commission neared completion, Feynman realized something. The official summary glossed over the depth of the problems. He refused to sign it unless he could append his own statement, an addendum that spelled out in plain language the root causes of the disaster. His words were direct and unforgettable. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. It was both a warning and a manifesto. Science, he reminded the world, is not optional. It doesn't yield to politics or optimism. It only yields to truth. Throughout the Commission's work, Feynman was struggling privately. His cancer, diagnosed earlier as a rare abdominal form, had returned. Chemotherapy drained his strength. Travel exhausted him. Yet he pressed on. He often arrived to meetings pale and trembling, but refused to quit. "I'm no hero," he said. "I'm just pissed off." His wife, Gwyneth, and children begged him to slow down, but he was adamant. This was too important. Feynman's role in the Challenger investigation catapulted him back into the public spotlight. He was hailed as the conscience of the Commission, the only member willing to speak plainly. Editorials praised his integrity. Television anchors replayed his ice water demonstration. Students sent letters of admiration. Even NASA engineers, who had once feared exposure, thanked him. He became a symbol of scientific courage in the face of institutional arrogance. The Challenger report led to major overhauls at NASA. Booster redesigns, management restructuring, improved risk assessment protocols. But more than the technical fixes, Feynman's philosophical warning echoed far louder. The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. It was a lesson not just for NASA, but for all institutions, that truth must be pursued above all else, and that the cost of ignoring it can be deadly. In his later book, What Do You Care What Other People Think?, Feynman described the Challenger experience with characteristic clarity and emotional restraint. He didn't dwell on heroism. He didn't gloat. He simply explained what went wrong, why it happened, and what it meant. To the end, he remained a scientist first, not a bureaucrat, not a politician, not a pundit, just a man asking honest questions, seeking honest answers, and refusing to be satisfied with anything less. By the 1982nd, Richard Feynman was more than a physicist, he was a public phenomenon. To some, he was the flamboyant genius with the New York accent and the infectious laugh. To others, he was a philosopher-scientist, challenging the status quo and uncovering deeper truths. But behind the charisma and accolades stood a man fiercely committed to one thing: the integrity of knowledge. In this chapter, we examine Feynman as both a showman and a skeptic, two sides of a coin that together defined his relationship with the public, the press, and the broader world of science. Feynman never sought the limelight, yet fame found him. In 1985, the publication of Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, a collection of humorous autobiographical stories, turned him into a cult figure. The book, compiled from conversations with his friend Ralph Layton, featured tales of safecracking at Los Alamos, learning to draw nude models, judging strip clubs in Vegas for scientific accuracy, playing the bongo drums at a samba school in Brazil. Refusing honorary degrees and academic snobbery, the stories were quirky, outrageous, and most importantly, true. Readers fell in love with his unfiltered honesty. Feynman wasn't some cloistered academic in a lab coat. He was a rebel, a joker, a man of the world. The book sold over 1 million copies and was translated into more than a dozen languages. It remains one of the most beloved memoirs by any scientist. Feynman's lectures had always been theatrical, but his rising fame brought him onto bigger stages. He gave public talks across the country, often to audiences who knew little about physics but were captivated by his style. He would walk on stage without notes, tap the blackboard rhythmically with his chalk, and speak as if explaining something for the very first time. His voice was animated, his hands in constant motion, and his eyes lit with mischief. He never condescended, he never hid complexity, but neither did he wallow in it. To Feynman, performance was communication. If people didn't understand, it wasn't their fault. It was his. If I can't explain something simply, it means I don't really understand it. Behind the charm and humor was a powerful skeptical engine. Feynman distrusted anything that didn't have evidence. Whether it was pseudoscience, philosophy, politics, or even the conclusions of other scientists, he challenged it. He often targeted what he called cargo cult science, research that mimics the form of science without its substance. His famous commencement speech at Caltech in 1974, titled Cargo Cult Science, remains one of the most cited manifestos on scientific integrity. In it, he warned, "The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool." Criticized cherry-picking data, over-reliance on pure consensus. Government-funded research without proper controls, education systems that rewarded memorization over understanding, his remedy, doubt, curiosity, and brutal self-honesty. Feynman disliked certainty. He bristled at scientific arrogance. To him, being unsure was a virtue, not a weakness. I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. This skeptical humility informed everything he did, from lecturing undergraduates to testifying about the Challenger disaster. He believed the role of a scientist was not to provide absolute answers, but to cultivate better questions. Despite his fame, Feynman had a complicated relationship with the media. He distrusted journalists who simplified science or who tried to mold him into a caricature. He refused television interviews unless he could speak freely. When approached by television producers to host a science show, he declined unless he could oversee all the scripts himself, which they refused. He didn't want to be a mascot for science. He wanted to be authentic. Still, his charisma made him a media favorite. His interviews, when he gave them, were gold. He told stories with passion, explained quantum mechanics with kitchen metaphors, and made even the dullest topics sparkle. Some of his most famous quotes: "I learned very early the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing something. I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers which might be wrong. Science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. We are trying to prove ourselves wrong as quickly as possible, because only in that way can we find progress. Physics is like sex. Sure, it may give some practical results, but that's not why we do it." These weren't quips for attention. They were insights born of decades of thinking. Despite his fame, Feynman remained committed to real scientific work. At Caltech, he continued mentoring students, refining quantum field theory, and contributing to nuclear physics and computing. He even pioneered quantum computing theory, suggesting in the early 1982nd that quantum systems might never be fully simulated by classical computers. His ideas would later inspire research into quantum algorithms and information theory. He was also an early thinker in nanotechnology, imagining machines that could manipulate atoms individually, ideas that inspired a generation of engineers and physicists. Feynman's blend of skepticism and joy was rare. He could dismantle pseudoscience with razor-sharp logic and then marvel like a child at a drop of water under a microscope. He wasn't a cynic. He was a realist, enchanted by reality. He believed the universe was far more wonderful than any myth, religion, or fantasy, and that wonder came from investigation, not imagination alone. To millions, Feynman became the model of what a scientist should be: curious, honest, playful, independent, doubtful, unafraid. He made it okay to not know. He made it cool to question. He taught that science wasn't about cold logic, but about the thrill of figuring things out. Richard Feynman was not just a theoretical physicist, he was a philosopher of science in action. Though he disdained traditional academic philosophy for its vagueness and abstraction, he spent his life wrestling with the most fundamental questions. What does it mean to know something? How do we find truth? What makes science different from other forms of thought? This chapter explores the core principles of Feynman's scientific worldview, his approach to knowledge, reasoning, error, doubt, and meaning. Science as a way of thinking. Feynman saw science not as a static body of facts, but as a method of approaching the unknown. He described it as a way of trying not to fool ourselves. He insisted that real science required observation, experiment, prediction, verification, rejection of authority and assumption. To Feynman, science was skeptical curiosity armed with discipline. Science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. He emphasized that no theory, no matter how elegant, was sacred. If it didn't match experiment, it had to go, period. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. In that simple statement is the key to science. Knowing versus naming. One of Feynman's earliest and most famous lessons came from his father. You can know the name of a bird in all the languages of the world, but when you're done, you'll know nothing about the bird. You only know what people call it. Now go out and watch it, see what it does, that's what counts. This distinction between naming and knowing became a lifelong theme. He warned against mistaking vocabulary for understanding. Just because someone can recite Newton's laws or the parts of a cell doesn't mean they grasp the meaning of those ideas. Feynman hated empty intellectualism. He believed understanding must be demonstrated preferably in plain, honest language. Feynman developed a teaching strategy now known as the Feynman technique, which reflects his beliefs about clarity and comprehension. It goes like this. Pick a concept you want to understand. Explain it out loud as if teaching a child. Identify gaps in your explanation and return to the source material. Simplify further. Use analogies. Remove jargon. He used this method not only to teach others, but to test himself. If he couldn't explain something clearly, he knew he didn't truly understand it. This brutal self-honesty kept his mind sharp and his science honest. Feynman championed doubt as a virtue. In a world eager for certainty, he remained comfortable with not knowing. I can live with doubt and uncertainty and not knowing. I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers that might be wrong. This attitude permeated his views on everything from quantum mechanics to human psychology. He distrusted absolute claims, whether from religion, politics, or science itself. To Feynman, the proper stance was always, this is what we know so far, but we might be wrong. What science can and can't do. Feynman had a clear-eyed view of science's power and its limit. Science, he said, can describe how things work, not why in an ultimate sense. It can tell you what stars are made of, but not whether it's beautiful to fall in love beneath one. He believed science was morally neutral, a tool that could be used for good or evil. That's why he emphasized human responsibility, especially after his involvement with the Manhattan Project. Science is a way of talking about the universe in which the words are predictions. It's not a moral code, it's not a path to happiness, but it is reliable when honestly done. He encouraged scientists to remain humble and socially aware, never mistaking knowledge for wisdom. Physics and beauty. Though he rejected mysticism and metaphysics, Feynman spoke often about the aesthetic power of nature. He saw beauty not as something diminished by science, but enhanced by it. I have a friend who's an artist. He says he sees beauty in a flower. I see it too, but I also see the cells and molecules inside. The deeper you look, the more beauty there is. He considered the laws of physics poetic, a kind of grand symphony written in differential equations and universal constants. For Feynman, understanding the world only deepened its wonder. In multiple essays and talks, Feynman warned about the dangers of self-deception in science. He was especially critical of researchers who ignored conflicting data, chased grants instead of truth, misled peers with selective reporting, confused correlation with causation, promoted vague or untestable theories. He demanded a standard of what he called utter honesty, an uncompromising willingness to admit ignorance, failure, and bias. His famous line, "You must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool," remains a moral compass for scientists to this day. Mathematics as a language. Feynman revered mathematics not as a sacred scripture, but as a language of nature. He was fluent in equations, but refused to worship them. If a formula didn't map to reality or intuition, he questioned it. Math is not just symbols, it's a way to think. He loved visual thinking diagrams, analogies, geometric intuition. His path integral and diagrammatic methods reflected this approach. He believed that deep understanding came not from calculation alone, but from grasping the core concept behind the symbols. Feynman's disdain for academic pretense extended to the classroom. He believed education should be about nurturing curiosity, not regurgitating facts. He criticized overloaded curricula, memorization without meaning, exams that punished creativity, lecturers who used complexity to mask ignorance. Instead, he advocated honest exploration, real-world examples, thought experiments, teaching through dialogue and joy. He didn't just want students to pass tests, he wanted them to fall in love with ideas, open to the unexplained but not gullible. Feynman maintained intellectual openness to the unknown. He was intrigued by reports of UFOs, ESP, and other fringe topics, but he demanded evidence. I don't know if flying saucers exist, but I know there's not enough data to say they do. He didn't mock people for believing strange things, but he insisted that belief without testing was not science, it was storytelling. If there was one principle at the core of Feynman's philosophy, it was this: the joy of finding things out. Not answers, not prestige, not control, but the sheer pleasure of discovery. He once said, "I don't need a final explanation. I don't even need a reason why. It's enough to know that nature is, and I get to find out how." In that spirit, he lived and thought. For all his brilliance and charisma, Richard Feynman was not without flaws, contradictions, and deeply human struggles. Behind the public image of the witty, fearless physicist was a more complex man, one who wrestled with loss, faced personal insecurities, and sometimes courted controversy. This chapter explores the less celebrated dimensions of Feynman's life: his emotional scars, ethical dilemmas, unpopular opinions, and moments of misjudgment. These hidden corners do not diminish his greatness, they complete it. Feynman's first marriage to Arlene Greenbaum, who died of tuberculosis in 1945, left an emotional crater that never fully healed. Though he later remarried and raised a family, friends and colleagues sensed that Arlene remained his most intimate connection. He would mention her in offhand comments, quote things she'd said, and keep her letters and mementos close. Most hauntingly, he wrote her a letter after her death, which he never mailed. Discovered in his personal papers decades later, it read, "I adore you, sweetheart. I find it hard to understand in my mind what it means to love you after you are dead. You, only you, are the one I want to talk to. You, only you, are the one I want to tell my problems. This unspoken grief shaped much of Feynman's emotional life. He was open with his mind, but guarded with his heart. In the 1962nd, Feynman married Gwyneth Howarth, a British woman who became his second wife and mother of his two children, Carl and Michelle. While he loved his family deeply, Feynman sometimes found domestic life difficult. He was consumed by research, prone to distraction, and often emotionally distant. Carl, his son, later described Feynman as fun, but not very accessible. He admired his father's mind, but sometimes longed for more warmth. He didn't like to talk about feelings, Carl said. Feynman's way of showing love was often teaching solving puzzles, playing logic games, or building gadgets with his children. He was more comfortable with ideas than emotions. Feynman's confidence in science was unmatched, but he was not immune to doubt. He feared stagnation. He worried about being a has-been after his Nobel Prize. He confessed in private letters that he sometimes felt intellectually dried up, especially in the 1962nd. "Am I doing anything real anymore?" he wrote to a colleague. "Or am I just coasting on the fumes of past ideas?" These periods of doubt pushed him to seek new frontiers: quantum computing, education reform, and the Challenger investigation. He hated complacency. His greatest fear was not failure, but irrelevance. Accusations of sexism, Feynman's memoirs, particularly "Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman," include stories that have drawn criticism from modern readers. He sometimes described picking up women using strategies that today seem manipulative or objectifying. In one story, he pretends to be aloof and rude to a woman as part of a calculated experiment in dating dynamics. Feminist scholars and readers have pointed out that these anecdotes reflect the casual sexism of mid-century culture, even if Feynman himself didn't intend harm. Defenders argue that he matured over time, especially after becoming a husband and father, but the stories remain troubling to many. Feynman never addressed these concerns publicly, perhaps unaware of how social norms were evolving, or perhaps unwilling to defend behavior he himself might later have seen as immature. Feynman's involvement in the Manhattan Project haunted him for the rest of his life. While he initially believed it was necessary to defeat Nazi Germany, he later realized that Japan was already on the brink of surrender before the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He never condemned the project outright, but neither did he fully justify it. "I felt numb," he said after the war. "At first we were proud, but later we realized what we had done." He became a lifelong advocate of scientific responsibility, urging physicists to think about the consequences of their work. Still, some critics argue he could have done more, spoken out louder, taken a firmer stance. Feynman chose pragmatic silence, which some interpret as moral ambiguity. Feynman had a love-hate relationship with academia. He mocked honorary degrees, refused memberships in elite societies, and declined the National Academy of Sciences invitation. He once said, "I don't believe in honors. The pleasure is in finding things out." But this anti-establishment stance sometimes alienated peers who valued institutional recognition. Some physicists viewed him as arrogant or performative. He also clashed with philosophers of science, whom he saw as detached and overly abstract. He believed that real science happened in the lab and on the chalkboard, not in ivory towers discussing metaphysics. His bluntness earned both admiration and resentment. Feynman's thirst for experience sometimes led him to blur ethical lines, particularly when it came to observing people. He would conduct experiments in social settings, such as trying different conversation styles on dates or testing whether salesmen lied about technical specs. To him, these were harmless games, extensions of scientific curiosity, but others might see them as manipulative or depersonalizing. He once admitted, "I don't always know where the boundary is between observation and intrusion. I just want to understand." That desire, pure, insatiable, sometimes overshadowed empathy, In the final years of his life, Feynman battled a rare cancer known as liposarcoma, which attacked his abdominal tissue. He underwent multiple surgeries, including the removal of a kidney and parts of his intestine. Despite the pain, he continued teaching, writing, and even testifying at the Challenger hearings. He approached death the same way he approached life, honestly and curiously. When doctors told him there was little more they could do, he said, "I've had a hell of a good time." His last words, as recorded by his friend Ralph Layton, were, "I'd hate to die twice. It's so boring." Feynman's life was a paradox. He was emotionally reserved, but intensely expressive. He was morally concerned, but not politically vocal. He was humble about knowledge, but proud of intellect. He was admired for honesty, but not always for sensitivity. These contradictions make him human, not a myth. They invite us to admire him not as an idol, but as a man who lived and thought deeply, sometimes imperfectly, and always authentically. As the 1982nd progressed, Richard Feynman's physical body began to betray the sharp mind it contained. Yet even as illness crept in, his intellectual fire remained undiminished. He continued to write, teach, question, and explore until the very end. In his final years, Feynman confronted mortality with the same honesty, curiosity, and irreverence that had characterized his entire life. He did not retreat from the world he engaged it, refusing to be defined by decline or fear. In 1978, Feynman had a malignant tumor removed from his abdomen. He downplayed the severity of it at the time. But the cancer liposarcoma, a rare and aggressive form, was never truly gone. By 1986, while working on the Rogers Commission after the Challenger disaster, Feynman began to experience worsening symptoms: pain, fatigue, digestive issues. He was no longer the energetic fireball of earlier decades, though he still summoned flashes of his former brilliance. He underwent multiple surgeries. Parts of his kidney and intestine were removed. Chemotherapy weakened his immune system. He dropped weight. His voice softened, but he refused to withdraw. "As long as I can think, I'm alive," he said. Knowing his time was limited, Feynman focused his energy on writing and storytelling. He worked closely with Ralph Layton to compile a second memoir, What Do You Care What Other People Think? This book, more reflective than "Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman," explored themes of love, ethics, and mortality. It included moving recollections of his relationship with Arlene, stories from the Challenger investigation, and philosophical musings on life and death. It was a farewell, delivered in the voice only Feynman could offer, funny, fearless, and wise. "You have no responsibility to live up to what other people think you ought to accomplish. I have no responsibility to be like they expect me to be." Feynman also began corresponding with old friends, students, and colleagues, tying up emotional loose ends, offering encouragement, and in some cases, saying goodbye without saying the words. To one student he'd mentored, he wrote, "Keep asking why, and don't be afraid of the silence that sometimes answers you." To his sister Joan, with whom he had shared a lifelong bond of science and silliness, he sent notes of gratitude and affection. Their relationship, rooted in shared curiosity, had sustained him for decades. To his children, Carl and Michelle, he left not money or monuments, but the enduring example of a life lived in pursuit of wonder. At Caltech, Feynman was treated not just as a faculty member, but as a legend. Even as his health declined, students sought him out. Colleagues visited his office just to hear him riff on quantum computing, art, or the philosophy of probability. He continued teaching in smaller doses, giving final seminars when his strength allowed. One memorable talk on quantum chromodynamics had attendees crying not from sadness, but from awe. "He was a flame," one student recalled. "Even when it flickered, it still gave off light." The Caltech community, students, staff, and faculty rallied around him, not with pity, but with reverence. In early 1988, Feynman was hospitalized for complications related to his cancer. Doctors told him the outlook was grim. He had the option of undergoing one more risky surgery to prolong his life by perhaps weeks, or refusing treatment and allowing the illness to take its course. He declined the surgery. His reasoning was as pragmatic as it was profound. "I've already had more than my share. It's time to go." His wife Gwyneth and his children were by his side during his final days. Friends came and went, some reading to him, others sitting in silence. Even as he drifted in and out of consciousness, he would occasionally crack a joke or pose a scientific question. On the 15th of February, 1988, Richard Feynman died at the UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles. He was 69 years old. His final recorded words, spoken with dry humor, were, "I'd hate to die twice. It's so boring." It was the perfect coda to a life lived fully, an acknowledgment of the inevitable, delivered with a wink. The scientific world mourned. Obituaries poured in from around the globe. Nobel laureates, students, authors, and artists paid tribute to the man who had taught them not just physics, but how to think. Caltech held a memorial service attended by hundreds. His bongo drums were placed near the podium. Instead of solemn hymns, the event featured laughter, storytelling, and even a brief physics demonstration, exactly as Feynman would have wanted. Many reflected on the paradox of his death, that a man so alive in mind could no longer be physically present. But most agreed he had not left. He lived on in the lectures he gave, the ideas he sparked, the people he taught, and the questions he inspired. Richard Feynman once said, "I have a friend who's an artist, and he says, 'Look at that beautiful sunset.' But I see more. I see the rays scattered by particles in the atmosphere. I see the curvature of the earth. I see the physics and the poetry." In his final years, as the sun set on his own life, Feynman never stopped seeing both, and he never stopped showing us how to look. In the long arc of scientific history, few names resonate with as much color, controversy, and charisma as Richard Phillips Feynman. His equations helped redefine the boundaries of quantum physics, but his mind, unruly, brilliant, irreverent, touched something deeper. He didn't just expand knowledge, he redefined how we pursue it. At every stage of his life, Feynman was driven not by answers, but by questions. Why do neutrons behave this way? What does it mean for a particle to take every path? Can I see the beauty of a flower in more than just its color? Why do people follow systems without understanding them? What's really going on behind the Challenger disaster? What does it mean to live a good life, knowing that death is certain? He was always asking and refusing to stop at the surface. I wonder why. 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 This recursive questioning wasn't a game. It was his engine, the source of his creativity, his insight, and his moral compass. Though he rejected schools of thought and philosophical labels, Feynman left behind a code of living, a kind of intellectual ethos. 1. Curiosity over conformity. Feynman never accepted something just because it was widely believed. He questioned Nobel laureates, politicians, textbooks, and even his own assumptions. 2. Joy in learning. He didn't study because he had to, he studied because he wanted to, because it was fun, because the universe was too beautiful not to explore. 3. Honesty above all. He refused to bluff. If he didn't know something, he admitted it. If data contradicted a theory, even his own, he accepted it. 4. Do it yourself. Feynman believed in rebuilding knowledge from the ground up. He didn't trust answers unless he could derive or visualize them personally. 5. Live fully. He drummed, danced, traveled, sketched, played, flirted, joked, and cried. He lived with intensity without shame or apology. Feynman's impact extended across domains. Physics, his path integrals, quantum electrodynamics, and Feynman diagrams reshaped the field. Education. His lectures became a new standard for clarity and engagement, science communication. He pioneered a style that made complexity human. Computing. He foresaw the challenges of simulating quantum systems, birthing ideas central to quantum computing. Ethics. He reminded scientists of their responsibility not just to knowledge, but to truth and humanity. In the words of others, Freeman Dyson, physicist, Feynman's voice was like no other in science. He spoke in pictures. He taught us not just what to think, but how to wonder. Murray Gell-Mann, collaborator and critic. He could be infuriating, but he could also see things no one else could. You couldn't help but be pulled into his orbit. Bill Gates, entrepreneur. Reading Feynman changed how I think about everything. The man who humanized genius. Feynman wasn't just a genius, he was relatable. He failed, he doubted, he made mistakes, he told dirty jokes, he forgot appointments, he annoyed his peers, he cried over lost love, he wondered if he'd ever matter again. And through it all, he never stopped asking why. That vulnerability made him ours. It made him not just a teacher of science, but a model for how to live with wonder and integrity. What he leaves behind. More than 30 years after his death, Feynman continues to inspire students who read his lectures and fall in love with physics, artists who turn his diagrams into jewelry and tattoos, educators who model their classrooms after his chalkboard magic, scientists who remember to question their own work because Feynman would have, thinkers who choose doubt, not dogma. He left no grand theory of everything, no rigid school, no empire of disciples. What he left was freedom. Freedom to think, to play, to fail, to ask. Picture Richard Feynman in a lecture hall. The lights dim. The chalk clacks. He spins toward the board and draws an arc, a photon here, an electron there. He turns, smiling. You see this? This is everything. And yet it's only a diagram. He laughs. Then he adds, nature has a way of being far more interesting than anything we can invent. He bangs his bongo drum, students laugh, time stops. And in that moment, we see what he saw all his life, that behind every formula, every particle, every mystery, there is beauty, there is truth, and there is always a reason to ask why.